Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video we're going to carry on our 3D Scan to Part series. Now this is going to be part 8 of the series, and it's part 5 of actually working in Fusion with the forms to make our wide body. Now, if you haven't been following along, the first couple of videos we talked about the scanning process. We used an iScan. In this case, it was a Pro HD, one that Shining 3D sent me. And in the following videos, we've been using Fusion 360 to actually create our wide body for my 1984 Mitsubishi Starion. Now, if you haven't been following along with the last 4 videos, then I do think it's important if you're trying to learn this process that you do start from the beginning. I do provide the files for each version, so if you want to start here or you had any difficulties, you can go to the description of the video and you can download the data set that you see on the screen. But it is important that you understand the entire process if you are trying to learn. Now, as I've mentioned in the previous videos, I am doing this in real time. We are going through it step by step, and I am not pre-modeling this fender and coming back and making basically a perfect version of it. What we're doing is we're going through the process step by step, and any problems or challenges that I run into along the way, we're going to work through those. So there's no shortcuts here. There's no cutting, there's no jumping or splicing. We are going through it in real time. Having said that, it is also important to note that I don't expect anybody to be actually making a wide body for this car. So while we are following along with this scan and this car, the overall idea here is going to apply to whatever scan you have and whatever car you have. So what we're going to be doing is we're ultimately going to be making a 3D print. So we'll be chopping up the different wide body pieces, 3D printing them, and putting them on the car to see how they look. Now, in the past couple videos, I've gotten a few comments. I've asked for feedback on details or features that you'd like to see. I had a comment for some canards, for some venting, and these are all features that we can get to, but generally those are going to be much easier and more realistic to do after the form is done. So in surfaces where we can have a little bit better control over things like the cutouts and creating things like the canards on the front. So we will get to those features, and I do appreciate all the comments always, so I will tackle those as surfaces later on. But at this stage in the game, what we want to do is we want to take a look at what we have and any updates and changes that we want to make. Now, in the last video, we started adding some detail because we connected all the pieces together. Now, if you're just opening this data set, then you'll probably have to go into the form's workspace, which means double clicking or right clicking and editing the form. Before you do that, I always think it's important that you hide all the other surfaces. If we don't, for example, if I show this fender, I'm going to come in and go into edit, then I'm going to get sort of this ghosted version of the fender, and that can be problematic whenever you're trying to model something. So I do like to hide those. The mesh body, it doesn't really matter, but I do like to hide sort of the original. Now, what we are going to talk about here is we're going to talk about some of the things that we still need to do to clean up this version of it. We haven't added all the detail. There's still more that we're going to do, but you'll notice that the wheel opening, the arch is not really smooth. We've added some extra edges and some things have changed. And now you can see that it's sort of pulled away in this corner. It's pulled away in this corner. So we need to fix that. Before I get too much further, there was a big Fusion 360 update this week. You might see some changes. If you open a file, it might ask you to update if it was created in an older version of Fusion. This is happening on February 4th, so Saturday, February 4th is when I'm filming this. This video will probably come out tomorrow. Depends on if I edit it tonight or not. But there is a chance, because there are updates that happen frequently, that you might need to update the form body. So just keep that in mind. I do want to also note that my settings here, the environment is photo booth, the effects, ground shadows, and ambient occlusion, anti-aliasing, those are all turned on. And my visual style is shaded with visible edges. Now, I do toggle back and forth between shaded, which is Control 4, and shaded with edges, Control 6. I like to do that because it helps me see the shape a little bit better and see how it reacts to the light. This helps me find problems in the design. And I also use Alt and 1 and Alt and 4, which allows me to go back and forth between box display and our smooth display. So keep those two things in mind. Those are generally the shortcut keys that I use quite a bit when I'm working with forms. Now that we have that said, let's talk about some of the issues or errors that we want to take care of, some things that we want to fix in here. So generally when you're working with forms and you're dealing with a wheel opening or a wheel arch that is mostly cylindrical. Now there are almost no cars out there where this is actually a true cylinder. In most cases, they're stretched out a little bit from the front to the back, or they're squared off in some cases, depending on what vehicle you're working on. In this case, we started out with a perfect cylinder and we had a really good match for the car, but as soon as we started to add more edges, things got a little out of hand. Now, one of the things that we want to look for when we're working in forms is that the edges should generally point to the center of the wheel. And what we have here is we've got these edges that point to the center of the wheel, but we've got some that are not. So you can see here, these are pointing down. And what ends up happening is this is going to cause us some problems in the curvature. So some of the things that I want to fix first is I want to go into insert point, and I'm going to just sort of re-topologize this by adding that edge. I'll double click this one and hit delete and sort of clean that up a little bit. Now, while that's not a perfect solution, a lot of times that does help us smooth things out a little bit. The next thing that we want to do is we want to fix what's going on in this corner. Now, this is a tricky one to do in forms because ultimately what we're looking to do is we're looking to try to match the curvature or the edges that are on this car. It's kind of hard to see in this sort of scan view, but we have some harder edges on the car that go straight back and terminate into this flare. And then we've got these harder edges that go back and actually roll up and over the arch. This kind of geometry is very tough to do with forms simply because of the way that forms works in Fusion 360. So we do need to manipulate things a little bit. And of course, when you're making a fender flare, you don't need to match the original geometry perfectly, but I do think it's nice to try to do that and work with it when you can. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin manipulating some of these edges by using edit form. I'm going to do a box select here. Now, I did have a comment about an older video. Someone was using box select and they were having trouble getting these edges when they were looking at it in the side view. Now, if you use box select, there's a couple things to think about. When you go from the top left to bottom right, box select will grab anything that's completely inside of the box. If you go from the bottom right to the top left, it's going to grab anything that the box touches. Now that's important because you'll notice that we've got edges and faces selected, but not vertices. It's just the way that it works. So whenever you're trying to select just this edge to move things around, top left to bottom right, and you want to double check your selection dialog for your selection filters. And you can see here that we've got T-spline edges, faces, and vertices. If I happen to have edges turned off, I won't be able to select the edges necessarily, but it is a selection priority. You can see here that it does end up turning itself on and off depending on your settings. Now the reason I mention that is because when you're out of the edit form tool and you go to your selection filters, you have a very different list here. You've got your T-spline body edges and faces and the T-spline vertices, but this is a different selection menu when you're in edit form. So just double check that if you are having problems following along in making those selections. With that out of the way, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to box select this edge here, which also will grab the one that's going straight back and begin manipulating the entire thing into position. Now, generally what we do when we're manipulating things manually like this, which is usually a last resort, you want to start by using things like scale and rotate and moving entire edges around. But when we're doing it manually like this, what we're trying to look for is the transition between each of these edges. We never want a straight line and we never want a drastic change. We want it to be very gradual. Same thing over here. We've got a fairly drastic change in terms of the angle between these two edges, and then essentially a flat or a completely straight line here. Now that's going to cause us problems, so I want to make sure that I move this around and I adjust these angles accordingly. So again, just moving it around a little bit. And now I'm going to go to Alt and 3 and take a look at the smooth display. And you can see we're a little bit closer. It is still pulling in this area just slightly, but it's looking better. Now, before I go any further, what I want to do at this stage is I want to use the utility make uniform. Now, this is something that when you're working in forms, you'll end up doing quite often because what it ends up doing, and if we go back and forth between box and smooth display, is it's going to take the geometry in the box display and the geometry in the smooth display and almost stretch them out. Now, the box display is our guide. It's the rule that we're using to create the curvature. And oftentimes the edges in smooth display, so for example, if we take a look at this edge, these edges are in different positions because ultimately what we're doing is we're driving the tangency and curvature directions. So when we use something like utilities and make uniform, pay close attention to some of the geometry. For example, in this area right here, when we say OK, you'll notice that these two edges stretched out just slightly. If I undo and redo, you can see what's happening is this edge pulls in just slightly and these edges spread out. So the make uniform is helping us relieve tension in certain areas of these different surfaces that we're creating. Now, it's not like a band-aid tool, but it's something that you do want to be comfortable with when you're playing around with your forms. Now, at this stage, I'll note that this is still not great. And if we take a look at this in box display, it's because of basically the angle of these edges and these transitions here is causing us problems. So I'm going to do a little bit more work here and see if I can sort of normalize this curvature. I'm going to pull this one up slightly. I'm going to pull this one down. And when I'm doing this, again, I'm looking at the change in angle between these edges, and I'm trying to make it the same as the change in angle between these edges. So when I go back to my smooth display, it's looking a little bit better. And once again, I like to use the utilities make uniform and just make sure that we don't have any drastic changes there. So that looks pretty good. I still have some areas over here that I want to fix. I'm always doing this in box display. I don't like to get into the habit of doing this in smooth display because it ends up creating bad geometry if you're trying to force the smooth display to look a certain way. So you want to really get comfortable with doing this in the box display and getting pretty good at it. From here, I will note that we have essentially the size of these faces is changing. It's getting fairly large up here and they're fairly small in this transition area. While that's not necessarily something that you have to avoid, it is something that is going to be potentially problematic if you start to bunch up geometry in some areas and have a pretty wide curvature or a wide distance between these edges in other areas. So just something to pay attention to. Again, not necessarily a bad thing or something that you have to avoid, but it is something that you want to keep in mind. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about in this wheel arch here is going to be this section here. This face is something that we 100% have to address. I generally avoid using T-points, which is essentially this edge where it ends at another edge. Now you'll notice here that this edge is still straight and this edge coming in just sort of terminates in the middle. And that's what we call a T-point. When you have a situation where it terminates and it creates a star point, it produces different geometry. So these are things that we need to look for, these T-points and star points. But more importantly, what we need to look for is we need to identify the fact that this face here has 3 sides that are up against our wheel arch and 2 additional sides that are over here in this large flat area. And generally, this is a bad way to deal with curvature. You don't want what's called an n-gon, something that has more than those number of sides. And then if we take it down one step further and we identify this T-point here, we now have added a 6th side. Now that T-point is at this stage is actually going to be carried over a little bit further. I don't like where it terminates, but at this point, we do want to make sure that we identify the number of faces that we have there. So that is a face that we have to take care of, and we have the same problem on the other side that we have to take care of. But before I do, I want to address the curvature coming in. Now, when you're starting to make designs like this, oftentimes you have a pretty good idea of where you want edges and changes in curvature to happen. When we use T-points, we can create good geometry, but we have to be careful where they end and where we want those transitions to happen. So if I use Control and 4, one thing that we can see is we've got a tight transition here. I'm going to get rid of the mesh to just speed this up a little bit. We've got a nice tight transition here and a nice tight transition here, and then it very gradually blends away where that T point ends. The same thing happens up here. We've got these two essential edges that end at T points, and then they start to fade away. If I want to drive that a bit further into the wheel arch, then I need to carry those edges a bit further. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play around with this on the back side by using Insert Point. And I'm going to take an edge from here and just sort of bring it straight forward and say, okay, allow it to create that geometry. Now it's thinking here, which is never a good sign. If it's thinking really hard about curvature, sometimes you're going to end up crashing Fusion. In this case, it seems to be okay. I'm going to repeat that and sort of roll the dice here. And I'm going to carry this one on. Remember, when you're using Insert Edge or Insert Point with this simple insertion mode, what you're doing is you're adding the edge where you're specifying without making any adjustments to the curvature. Now, the reason that's important is because we generally avoid straight edges. In this case, I'm going to allow it. So I'm going to do, in this case, Alt-3 to look at Smooth Display. I'm going to go to Utilities and make Uniform. And just take a look at the results with Control and 4 and see if those edges are carrying further into the design. You can see that they are, but they've created this weird ripple in this end-on surface. And that's because it doesn't really know what needs to happen in that corner. In that corner, we are going to essentially we need to figure out what we want to happen in that. So when we look at it from the side, one of the things that we might decide to do is use Insert Point and maybe carry this edge further into the design. So I'm going to do this by, in the box display, by carrying this edge and making a triangle here. And I'm going to undo this, but we're going to do this just to take a look at what this does to our curvature. So when we have this, what ends up happening is we're bulging that surface out, and the triangle is going to essentially be a flat patch. It might be okay, but really what I'm looking to see is I want to see that curve go up and over. This can be really hard to visualize, so sometimes using a zebra analysis can help. And in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and increase these lines. And what we're going to see here is that we've got these edges where we've got those two tightly packed edges. Those two tightly packed edges are carrying forward just fine. But when we get into this triangle region, we really don't have good curvature. Things are sort of bunching up and it's going all sorts of different directions. And we can even see there's a little ripple that happens, and I guarantee you that there's an edge right there. When we look at what's happening over the fender, this looks really good. I'm happy with that. But then over here, again, in that end gun, you can see that the curvature is just sort of going in this weird direction. We really like to carry this in and go up and over and carry it out. But the triangle is not the way to do this. So let's bring our edges back. Let's go back into box display. Let's get rid of that. Another option that we have is to try to carry this from here and just carry it into the wheel arch. And we don't have to go all the way, but I am going to for this example. And once again, we want to make sure that we use our tools to manipulate this. We don't want it to be completely flat there. We'll take a look at it in Smooth Display. I'm going to use Make Uniform. It's always a good idea for us to do this. Control and 4 to hide my edges. And that's looking a little bit better. There's still kind of a weird bulge here that I want to take care of. But if we take a look at Inspect and Zebra Analysis, we'll make these horizontal. We'll increase the number of repeats. Now we can see that we're carrying the curvature in. We've got something happening in this corner that's probably less than ideal. But what I can see here is that the curvature is carrying over much smoother than it was when we had that triangle. And these are the kinds of things that we want to look for. The differences in the direction that we're going with each of these edges is going to make a big difference. So let's cancel the zebra stripes again, bring the edges back, and note that now we have this star point here. Now, before I get too far ahead of myself, I want to repeat that same process over here because we are dealing with the same sorts of curvature. Now, I'm going to go to modify and edit form. I want to tighten this up and make these a little bit more horizontal, and maybe rotate this around to the front and move them to the correct positions. I can always move these around later, but I just want to make some minor adjustments before I add any additional edges. We're going to use modify insert point. Just like before, we're going to carry this forward. We're going to right click and repeat that, do the same thing down here. These are going to be our driving curvature edges. And then we're going to carry this one in. The red dot is going to be our midpoint. We're going to follow the midpoint all the way in. And once again, we could add T-points here. We don't necessarily need to carry it all the way into the fender well. But I kind of feel like if I can avoid T-points, then I try to. Now, as I'm pulling this one in, I might decide to make some adjustments and change the direction of this one here. So we kind of, it's kind of hard to describe, but we want to make sure that the spacing between all of these is as symmetric as possible. It doesn't have to be perfect, but the more time we spend making things as uniform as possible, the better the overall result generally is. Again, it's not something that is perfect, but generally speaking, it is better if we can make things uniform. So just going to move that around and take a look at the result here. Again, when we use insert point or insert edge and we use that simple insertion mode, it's going to make it flat. So we want to manually move things around. Take a look at this in smooth display. I'm going to go to make uniform and Control and 4 to hide my edges. Now you can see we're starting to carry that curvature up a little bit. Now there's still a lot of work that we need to do here, but overall I think it's looking much better. I'm going to take a look at the zebra analysis again. Horizontal stripes, increase the repeats, and what we should see here is that on these edges we're carrying the curvature into the fender, and this one still has some weird wave going on that we need to fix. But on the back, we see the same thing. We're carrying that curvature into the fender. And then on the back, we sort of have a wave here that we need to fix. But overall, I think this is a better result. We're moving toward a better result. So I know at this point, we're 23 minutes in. It probably doesn't seem like we did a lot. But it is important that we spend the time now tweaking these little nuances of the design before we get too far into the rest of the design. So back in box display, what I want to do is I want to continue tweaking and adjusting these shapes. So I'm going to go to insert point and I want to carry this in one more time. I'm going to repeat this. I'm going to carry this one down to here using these T-points. I like to use my right click marking menu. It's really quick, especially when we're using the same tool over and over again, to just drag it to the right or the 3 o'clock position for OK, and then to drag it up to the 12 o'clock position for repeating that last command. Now at this stage, once we have these edges added, I can come in and I can make adjustments to these edges to add a little bit more curvature. I can push them closer together. The same thing here. I'm going to leave the one that intersects with the fender well or the wheel opening, but I'm going to move these around to tighten them up. Now, if I take a look at this in smooth display, they're still relatively far apart. You can see that those edges are quite far apart. In order for us to really get a tight transition, they have to be really close together. Now, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to move these a bit closer together. I'm going to do the same thing with this one. And then take a look in smooth display. I'm going to try my make uniform utility. See if we can tighten those up a little bit. So now Control and 4, get rid of the edges. You can see that we're starting to build out those sort of tighter transitions that blend away into the fender. These are the very tricky kinds of details when you're working in forms. They're very hard for us to get these harder details in, and honestly, they're usually easier to do in surfaces than they are to do in forms. The other thing that we want to talk about is how we're going to meet the door or transition to the door, because this bulge here is not ideal. So what I want to do is I want to start to think about what this shape is going to look like where it meets the door. Now for me, I'm going to take this vertex back. I'm going to move it in toward the car. And I'm going to take the next vertex up and move it in toward the car a little bit. And potentially take these two and move them together. Anytime you have a feature that is a somewhat consistent width, you want to try to move it all together as one. And this feature down here, the door, I guess the distance away from the door is pretty wide. And I want to move that back in toward the door just a little bit as well. So I'm going to sort of bring that in. And then again, these two right here are going to be important. So I'm going to select that edge and I'm going to pull that in closer to the car as well. And then this one here, I'm going to select that edge, pull it in closer to the car as well. Now the reason I'm doing that is because I want the fender flare to have a gap close to the door, but I also want to make sure that it doesn't just look too bulky. And oftentimes what can happen is it can just kind of look awkward and look bulky, and that's not what I want. So now that I'm starting to get that detail, this is still a fairly basic looking fender. It doesn't really have any extra sort of craziness to it. It just kind of looks very mild and very bulged out. So it doesn't look very extreme, but it is giving us the extra width that we need to sort of handle the wider tires. But let's go ahead and start adding some edges as we get closer to the end of this video so we can start forcing some tighter detail. And what I want to do is I want to talk about a couple of tools that we can use. In this case, I'm going to double click an edge, make sure that I get a full loop. Then I'm going to go into Modify and Bevel Edge. Now, Bevel Edge is an interesting tool, and it's one of the ones that I kind of like to use. I'm going to take a bevel edge in at, let's say, 0.08, which is pretty tight. And using a number of segments of 1, what this is going to do is it's going to take the edge that we have selected. It's going to essentially get rid of that edge, move one edge 0.08 away, and add another edge 0.08 in the opposite direction from our selected edge. Now, this is a little bit tricky to think about, but when we insert an edge, we leave the edge we have selected in the place wherever it is, and then we add another one next to it. When we use bevel, this helps us when we use just a single segment. This helps us get away from having that flat distinction, that flat face or flat edge between the selected edge and the new one. So I'm going to say OK. And this helps us drive some curvature into the design. So now if I use Control and 4 to hide my edges, I'm going to hide the base as well. As we rotate this around, we're starting to see a tighter transition in that area. And when you can see what happens here is it starts to create that flared shape as we get down here. As we rotate around to the back, it's carrying over into that feature. And you can see that it's carrying out here. Now what this doesn't help us with is it doesn't help us with what happens as it gets further down the fender. We don't want it everywhere, but sometimes it's easier to add a bevel in certain places and then get rid of edges we don't want. So once we're happy with the overall shape, and what I mean by happy is we can select the edge and we can use things like slide edge. If we want to get it a little bit tighter or a little bit looser, we could move those things around. And once we're happy with that, if I want it to terminate as it gets closer to this transition, I'm going to select this edge. I'm going to Control and double click this edge, which will grab everything between, and just hit delete. I'm going to do the same thing over at the front. As soon as it hits this edge here, Control and double click and delete. I'm going to use Control and 4 to hide my edges. And what we should see is now that crease is going to disappear and not carry down the rest of the fender. And once again, this is just not ideal in most cases, but this does help us drive the curvature a bit tighter. If you want that to flare away, one thing that you can do is you can start to use insert point and transition these edges away. So for example, if we want this tight crease to go up and follow that geometry, we're going to end up making some triangles. But what we can do is we can go from this point to this point right here. And then we can get rid of these edges hit delete, and Alt and 3 to take a look at smooth display. So we've added a star point here, which is generally bad, but without having to go through all of the hard work of trying to fix that manually, what we can do is we can use our utilities and repair body. It finds that star point, which in this case is an error point because it's red, and if we click on it, Fusion does a pretty good job of tweaking and adjusting that for us. So you can see that it automatically made a pretty nice curve and transition there. So we'll say OK, Control and 4 to hide our edges. And now what we should see is that transition goes from back here and up and over the fender. We still have this sort of a weird bulge here, and that's just a product of the way that the fender is flared at this time. That's something that we're going to have to take a look at. But let's do a quick inspect, zebra analysis, make these horizontal, increase the repeats. And what we're looking at here is now up front, we're starting to see this hard edge carry into the fender, or into the wheel arch, and we're seeing this one here carry up and over. And then back here, you can kind of see it's carrying back into that corner. So that's what we're looking for. We need to fix the bulge in this area, which we will take care of. But we're looking to see where these zebra stripes are bunched up and how the curvature is transitioning. So this looks like a pretty good result so far. It's not perfect, it's not ideal, but it is important for us to identify when we can use things like, in this case, the repair bodies, which will help us identify ways in which we can use these tools without having to manually break everything up. So as I said, this is far from over. Unfortunately, this stuff is time consuming. As I mentioned, we're going through this together. I haven't pre-made this specific fender. So we're running into these different challenges and problems as we go along the way, the things that you would likely run into. Now, forms in itself is very tricky. It takes a lot of time, a lot of practice. I've done probably hundreds of videos on forms at this point. And each time I still have to go through the same process of adding edges in different areas, seeing how the curvature flows, because every shape is going to be slightly different. There's a lot more that I want to do to this design that I'm trying to sort of temper, because every time I look at it, I want to fix a few things, but I want to focus on just these main points. What I suggest you do from here is you take a look at the same things that we just did, changing the direction of that curvature, and you see if you can transition things on your own. Find ways in which you can make these transitions, figure out how you want the shape to sort of blend and move on your side, and see if you can find a good shape that you like. So in this case, I'd have to go back to repair body, fix that star point, allow it to sort of adjust those curves for me, and just take a look at the overall shape. Now, so far I'm pretty happy with this. I do want to fix what's going on in this bulge right here. And what I mean by that is just the shape of the fender is too wide. You can see that this point here is too wide. I really want to make sure that we stick to around 30 minutes in these videos, but I just cannot leave this how it is. So let's just adjust this real quickly. And essentially what we want to do is we just want to pull this back. And what I'm looking to see is that these two edges are parallel or relatively close to parallel. I want to make sure that it's not bulging drastically in that area, because this is going to just produce some funky geometry. So let's go ahead and just take a look at it from the back. Looks okay. Let's take a look at it from the top as well. Sometimes that can be a pretty good indicator of what the shape is doing. So we can see here from the top, that looks like it's pretty far out. I'm going to go ahead and move that back, maybe move this whole edge back. Remember, at this point, we haven't attached it to the, in this case, we haven't really attached it to the mesh. We're just using it as a reference. So that looks pretty good. I probably want to take this edge back. So I'm going to select there. I'm going to control double click here and just move this in. And what this will do is this will help drive the shape. Now it looks like I missed an edge, so I'm going to do Control Z. I'm going to make sure I take that one with me as well and push that in. So now if I take a look at this, Alt 3, Control 4, I'm a bit happier with that shape. It's not quite as bulky in that area. There's still more that we can do, but overall that looks a little bit better. So that's a good place for us to stop. Let me go ahead and save the work before I lose anything. And as we carry on, what I think I want to do from here, because we've really tackled a lot of the basics, a lot of the general shape creation, I don't want to scrap everything that we've done, but I do want to start to make this a little bit more out there, because most of the time when you're creating these wide bodies, you're making something that's very unique to you. So I want to take what we've done without losing all of that information, and I want to start to make it a little bit more aggressive and a little bit more unique. So if you have any questions to this point, please let me know. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.